Welcome. I'm Clark Korb, a holistic health practitioner offering some pragmatic insights to help you live a happier, more empowered life and embody your optimum potential. Today, I'll be examining the concepts of causality and karma, along with a recommendation of how to work with these concepts more beneficially toward the betterment of our own evolution and improved learning of our life and soul lessons. So, to start with a definition, causality is just the relationship between cause and effect, or often action and consequence. It's very natural for our human condition to want to ascribe a cause to an observed effect. And in some instances, causality is very readily discernible. An example would be if you're walking barefoot in the rain, it will yield the consequence of having wet feet. The word consequence, in and of itself, to describe this cause and effect relationship, is not inherently negative, although we tend to use it in context in much of our common language as having a negative association with it, a consequence being a bad thing, in other words, or when describing an action which merits a punitive outcome, whether by natural or human imposed responses. For example, the consequence of getting poor grades in high school will likely limit the opportunities of admission into certain universities leaving high school. So, despite our common usage of it in this way, consequence is not always a negative outcome or one worthy of condemnation. To continue with our example of walking barefoot in the rain, having wet feet while entering a cold room with no towel or socks nearby could make for being cold and an uncomfortable situation, ultimately being a natural or negative consequence to walking barefoot in the rain. However, having wet feet while walking around outside in the grass on a warm summer day may feel refreshing and nourishing. In other words, the context matters a lot when assigning negativity toward this effect or this consequence of the action. So, outside the general definition of causality or cause and effect, we have two very specific sort of implementations of cause and effect that are a part of our human behavior as a society. One is in the form of our justice system, or a legal form of cause and effect. In other words, our legal or justice system imposes consequences or penalties defined by legislators and enforced by authorities to punish an individual for wrongdoing. In other words, a criminal action merits a legal penalty or a consequence in response to that action. Well, there's also another form of cause and effect or causality, which is in the realm of the sort of spiritual domain. And this is karma. This does not require any human or systemic definition, enforcement, or intervention. This is really a belief that actions from the past will yield either punishment or blessings in the future as a natural or spiritual consequence. Now, people don't necessarily have to refer to karma by its name or as part of a formal doctrine, but they can still hold that this belief is true. This is really akin to the philosophy of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And it often can set up a zero-sum game type of scarcity belief, which sabotages living in prosperity for future bringing upon a time of scarcity in the future. And it really implies that we must suffer for our misdeeds rather than realize that all experiences are really just steps in growing and learning and evolving as human beings. Now, the larger problem with the hyper focus on setting up this causality or karma, if you will, is that we as humans tend to be pretty quick to assign blame in order to attribute a causal mechanism to an undesired or observed effect. An example of this would be wanting to find the action which generated a negative consequence so that we can correct the action and avoid the consequence in the future. Or maybe we want to enact a reciprocal and just consequence to atone for a harmful action or behavior. So the intention to correct problematic behavior is good, but sometimes the assignment of causality may be false or misleading. And with this, there can be a tendency to overcorrect or misdirect a corrective action. Sometimes causality is readily determined, like the example of walking barefoot in the rain will tend to generate the consequence of having wet feet. However, causality is in many cases not so easily ascertained. For one, we may incorrectly conflate correlation with causation. A correlation does not imply causation. An easy example to illustrate this would be to look at the sale of baseball gloves and snow cones. There's no causal link between these two items, but the sales of both may rise during the warmer months of spring and summer since they are both positively correlated to warmer weather. Another issue is that causality may be multivariate. In other words, there isn't just one single variable which drives or produces an outcome, and each variable might be different in the weight or magnitude with respect to how it impacts a given outcome. Also, an observer may have a limited scope as to what transpires in time in order to accurately determine causality. An example of this would be not having visibility to the entire length of a cycle in time, where a phenomenon that has a cyclical nature wouldn't be viewed as such if your narrow of time of examination is too small within that cycle. Similarly, an observer might have a limited scope in terms of what is observable in space to determine causality. If your perspective is too close, you can only see the tip of the iceberg, for example, or you cannot see the forest through the trees. Also, an observer may have limited understanding or background to properly interpret what is being observed to accurately determine causality. And there are many examples of this in terms of the perpetuated medical myths, such as going outside with a wet head will cause pneumonia, when actually pneumonia is caused by an external pathogen, whether it's a viral, a bacterial, or fungal infection. And the list of antiquated medical diagnoses is very long. I'm just picking one example there. In addition to all these problems with determining causality accurately, the key takeaway from an emotional or spiritual perspective is that this hyperfocus on causality or karma tends to set up a pattern where a belief in a nearly always negative causality or something which merits punishment sets up a vibration within yourself that attracts more negativity or is more likely to expect negative outcomes. This is a simple result of the law of attraction, where like attracts like. My mom used to have a favorite saying that I'm sure was handed down to her from at least one or more generations was, if you burn your ass, you'll sit on scabs. So this really implies that if you make a mistake, that the punishment is merited and that you're stuck dealing with the penalty of some kind of negative consequence, a judgment, or a karmic retribution. Now, one could restructure this saying as something like, if you burn your ass, you'll learn not to pick a hot seat in the sun next time. Or maybe, if you burn your ass, you'll learn how to heal a wound effectively. Or possibly even further, if you burn your ass, you'll learn how to appreciate more deeply the times when you can move, or sit in this case, with ease and are free of pain. The common thread among all of these is that you will learn something valuable. And trials are inevitable and a part of life and how we grow and learn. So an alternative or more positive framing of this idea of cause and effect, or karma, however you want to look at it, is to respond to our trials with loving kindness. This is loving kindness to oneself, loving kindness to others, and this learning to love yourself and others, especially in the face of adversity or challenges or trials, is particularly difficult and absolutely essential. If we have the perspective that recognizing all of these trials are lessons, we can eschew attachment to karmic guilt, fear, or propensity to attract more negative outcomes. In addition to this, we can train ourselves to respond mindfully instead of reacting impulsively. If we can embrace a little bit of humility and recognize that, while in some cases causality may be clearly established, we should learn from it. And in many other cases, our association of what might be causal or potentially a form of karma might be extremely inaccurate. Byron Katie offers a particularly great sequence of questions, which she calls the work, which is a useful way to help us step back and take a moment of introspection about anything in particular that is a judgment or a belief, or in this case, an assessment maybe of cause and effect, or a karmic retribution that we're taking on ourselves or ascribing to someone else that causes suffering. And so the questions that she has for this are, is it true? Can you absolutely know that it's true? How do you react when you believe that thought? And who would you be without the thought? And the thought in this example is anything that would be the distressing cause and effect relationship, or the punitive effect or trial that you're going through or observing someone going through. In my experience, even using the first two of these questions, is it true and can you absolutely know that it's true, are particularly powerful in helping reframe and step back and help you maybe reevaluate the validity of the constructs that you've set up for cause and effect, or causality in this sense. I also like to add the question for myself in terms of responding to any kind of trial, to really lean into that idea of, what is the gift in this for me? So my recommendation, for those of you interested in a little bit of homework, would be to identify a pattern or a couple of patterns of negative causality, in other words, a cause and effect with a negative consequence based on a past or present trial which you have endured. After applying these above questions, which I just went over, How might you reframe the lesson you gained from this trial to be more positive, more empowering, and liberating in a way which better supports you going forward? Let me know in the comments below. If you know of anyone who may benefit from what I've shared here, please forward this video to them. And if you found some value in what I've discussed today, I would most certainly appreciate your giving the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It's free, it only takes a moment, and it really helps support the growth of the channel. Thank you for tuning in.